Judy Maxwell had never doubted her place in the world. The farm was her life, her identity, and her legacy, and she never once imagined she would have to fight for something that had always been hers. From the moment she was old enough to walk, she had followed her father, Leonard Maxwell, across every inch of the land, absorbing the rhythms of the seasons, learning when to till the soil, when to rotate crops, how to mend fences before winter storms made the ground too hard to work. The farm had been in their family for over 80 years, passed down through generations, expanding, evolving, surviving every hardship thrown its way, from droughts to financial downturns. She was the one who had stayed, the one who had committed herself to its future, while her younger sister Samantha had long ago turned her back on it, preferring the comfort and opportunities of city life. Their mother Caroline had followed suit, moving to a suburban condo in St. Louis as soon as Judy's father had started slowing down, leaving Judy alone to run things. It had never been a problem, never a question until the day her father died, and everything she had built, everything she had worked for, came under attack. It started at the funeral. Samantha arrived late, stepping out of a sleek black SUV, looking as though she had come for a business meeting rather than to bury her father. Her hair was styled to perfection, her designer coat barely wrinkled despite the cold wind sweeping through the cemetery. She had barely spoken to Judy in years, their interactions reduced to short, awkward calls on holidays, and even those had stopped when their father's health began to decline. But now, she was here, not out of grief but obligation, standing beside their mother, who had spent most of the past few years treating Judy as little more than a caretaker for the man she had long since stopped loving. Judy felt the tension radiating off them both as the ceremony ended, and they moved toward her, their expressions carefully neutral, their words measured. "We should talk," Samantha said, her voice smooth but firm, as if she were already in control of the conversation. Judy didn't want to talk, not now, not today, but she knew better than to think they would let her grieve in peace. She nodded stiffly and let them follow her back to the farmhouse, the home she had spent years maintaining, the home that now, suddenly, didn't feel as safe as it had before. They sat at the old wooden dining table, the same table where she and her father had spent countless nights going over finances, planning harvests, discussing repairs. Caroline looked around the room with thinly veiled distaste, taking in the well-worn furniture, the practical but outdated decor, the lingering scent of fresh-baked bread and soil. Samantha sat with perfect posture, hands folded in front of her, her expression unreadable. Judy, their mother, began, her voice overly gentle, the kind of tone that signaled bad news was coming. "You've done an incredible job here, really, but now that your father is gone, it's time to think about the future." Judy stiffened. "The future." Samantha leaned forward slightly. "Dad left this farm to both of us," she said. The words hit Judy like a slap. "No, he didn't," she said, her voice sharper than she intended. "Dad made it clear years ago that the farm would be mine. He updated his will, signed the paperwork. I was there." Samantha sighed, shaking her head as if Judy were a child who didn't understand how the world worked. "That's the thing. We don't think he was in the right state of mind when he did that." Judy stared at her in disbelief. "Are you serious?" Caroline reached out as if to comfort her, but Judy pulled back before she could touch her hand. "Sweetheart, you have to understand. Your father loved you, but he wasn't well. He was getting forgetful, making decisions without thinking things through. This farm belongs to the family, not just you." Judy could barely breathe. "I ran this farm. I took care of him. I kept this place alive while you both left." Samantha shrugged. "And we appreciate that. But that doesn't change the fact that things need to be handled properly now." Judy's hands clenched into fists under the table. "What does that mean?" "It means we're contesting the will," Samantha said plainly, as if she were discussing nothing more than a routine business deal. "Mom and I already spoke to a lawyer. There are a lot of ways to prove that Dad wasn't thinking clearly when he signed it over to you. We're going to make sure the farm is handled in a way that benefits everyone." Judy's pulse pounded in her ears. "This isn't a negotiation. I am the legal owner of this farm." For now, Samantha said with a slight smile. Judy shot up from her chair, the legs scraping loudly against the wooden floor. Get out. Caroline sighed heavily. Judy, don't be dramatic. This is what's best for the family. The family? You haven't given a damn about this place in years. And she turned to Samantha, her voice shaking with rage. You never wanted this farm. You hated it here. So don't pretend this is about family. Samantha stood, adjusting the cuffs of her expensive coat. You're right. I don't want to live here. But that doesn't mean I don't deserve my share. Your share, Judy laughed bitterly. You didn't earn a single piece of this land. It's not about what's fair, Samantha said simply. It's about what's legal. Judy wanted to throw them both out, to slam the door and lock it behind them, to pretend none of this was happening. But the weight of their words, the cold certainty in Samantha's voice, settled in her chest like a stone. This wasn't just an empty threat. This was war. Judy sat in silence long after her mother and sister had left, staring at the now empty chair where Samantha had been sitting. Her carefully composed expression still burned into Judy's mind. The air in the house felt heavier, suffocating, as if the walls themselves knew what was coming. Her father's farm, the land she had dedicated her life to, was no longer just hers. It was now a battlefield, and the people standing on the other side of the line were the very ones who were supposed to be family. The next morning, she woke to find a legal notice stuck between the slats of her front gate. It was crisp, official, printed on expensive paper with the emblem of a well-known law firm stamped at the top. She already knew what it was before she even opened it, but that didn't stop her stomach from twisting into a tight knot as she read the words. A formal challenge to the will had been filed. Her mother and sister were claiming that their father had not been of sound mind when he had signed the documents leaving the farm to her, arguing that his decision had been coerced, that he had been manipulated into shutting them out. They were demanding that the court place an injunction on the property, freezing her ability to sell, renovate, or take out any financial leverage on the land until the case was resolved. Judy felt a slow, burning rage coil in her chest, but beneath the anger was something worse: fear. If they won, she could lose everything. Not just the legal right to the farm, but the very ability to control what happened to it in the meantime. If an injunction was granted, she wouldn't even be able to repair equipment, hire workers, or access funds related to the property. It would be as if the farm was in legal limbo, waiting for someone else to decide its fate. She knew she needed to act fast. She drove straight to her attorney's office, gripping the steering wheel so tightly her knuckles turned white. Mark Davidson had been handling her father's legal affairs for years, a no-nonsense man who had always been fair and thorough. He listened in silence as she explained what had happened, his expression unreadable as he flipped through the legal document she had handed him. Finally, he set it down and leaned back in his chair. "They're playing hardball," he said simply. Judy scoffed. "Tell me something I don't know." Mark exhaled slowly, tapping his fingers against the desk. "The good news is the will is solid. Your father signed it while he was still fully capable, and we have medical records to back that up. There's no evidence that he was incompetent at the time, and he had multiple witnesses present when he finalized it." Judy's shoulders tensed. "And the bad news," Mark hesitated. "They don't need evidence to drag this out. They just need doubt. If they can make a judge believe that there's even a chance that your father wasn't thinking clearly, this could take months, maybe longer. And in the meantime, if the court grants their injunction, you'll be stuck. You won't be able to do anything with the farm until this is settled." Judy's head pounded. "So what do we do?" Mark leaned forward, clasping his hands together. "We fight back. Immediately. We counterfile to dismiss the challenge based on lack of evidence. We get sworn statements from the witnesses who were there when your father signed the will. We pull his medical records, his financial records, anything that proves he was making clear, rational decisions up until the very end." Judy nodded, trying to focus on the legal strategy rather than the storm of emotions building inside her. She had known Samantha would be ruthless, but seeing it laid out so clearly in legal terms made it feel more real. Her sister wasn't just trying to claim what wasn't hers, she was trying to destroy Judy's ability to function, to force her into a corner where she would have no choice but to settle. By the time she left the attorney's office, she was exhausted, but she knew there was no time to rest. She needed to get ahead of this. If they wanted to question their father's mental state, then she would have to show them exactly how wrong they were. She spent the next few days gathering everything she could. She dug through old paperwork, pulling out financial records that showed their father had been making sound, logical decisions right up until the day he died. She found emails he had sent to suppliers, messages he had exchanged with business partners, all clear proof that he had been fully in control. But then things started getting worse. At first it was small things. A notice from the bank stating that there had been an attempt to change the account information associated with the farm's operating funds. A contractor she had been working with suddenly backing out of a repair job, citing uncertainty about the property's future. Calls from local suppliers, hesitantly asking if she was still in charge. Then she found strangers on her land. It happened early one morning. She was walking the perimeter of the fields when she saw them, 3 men she didn't recognize, surveying the property as if they already owned it. They were dressed too neatly to be farmers, their polished boots standing out against the dirt, their clipboards and measuring tape an unmistakable sign of something bigger. She approached them, keeping her voice even despite the unease creeping into her gut. "Can I help you?" One of the men looked up, offering a polite but distant smile, just taking some preliminary measurements for what she demanded. The man's smile didn't waver. Potential land development. Judy felt her stomach drop. "This land isn't for sale." He gave a small, almost amused nod. "That's not what I was told." Rage flared in her chest. "Who told you that?" But the man didn't answer. He simply exchanged a glance with his colleagues, then tucked his clipboard under his arm. "You might want to check with the county," he said vaguely before walking off. Judy watched them go, heart pounding. Samantha was already trying to sell the farm, not after the case was settled. Now, Judy wasted no time. She drove straight to the county office, demanding to see any paperwork related to her property, and that's when she saw it. A filing had already been submitted, a request to transfer ownership of the farm into a holding trust. Her sister wasn't just contesting the will. She was trying to lock Judy out of her own land entirely. For the first time since this had started, real fear set in. This wasn't just about money. This was about taking away everything she had left. Judy had never felt so trapped in her own home. The walls of the farmhouse, once a place of comfort, now felt like they were closing in on her, and every time she looked out the window, she half expected to see another stranger wandering across her land like they already owned it. The legal battle had barely begun, yet it was clear that Samantha wasn't going to wait for the courts to decide the outcome. She was moving fast, laying the groundwork for a future in which Judy was nothing more than an unwanted occupant, a stubborn inconvenience that needed to be removed. The filing at the county office had shaken her to her core. Samantha had requested that the farm be placed into a holding trust, a move that suggested she fully expected to take control of it soon. Worse, the paperwork had already made its way through several levels of approval before Judy had even known about it. If she hadn't gone to check, if she hadn't pushed for answers, she might not have learned about it until it was too late. It sent a clear message her sister wasn't just challenging the will, she was acting as if she had already won. Judy had stormed back into her lawyer's office that same afternoon, shoving the county documents onto Mark Davidson's desk, her voice laced with barely controlled fury. "How is this even possible? She doesn't own the farm. She has no right to do this." Mark scanned the papers, his brow furrowing as he read. "She's making a preemptive move," he said after a long silence. "She's assuming that once the will is contested and put under review, she can argue that the property needs to be placed in a neutral trust until the legal proceedings are finished. It's an aggressive tactic, but not unheard of." Judy's hands clenched into fists at her sides. "So what do we do?" Mark leaned back in his chair, tapping his fingers against the desk and thought. "We challenge it immediately. We file an emergency motion to block the transfer and present evidence that she's trying to undermine the court's process. We also need to document every attempt she's made to interfere with the farm's operations. Have you noticed anything else strange lately? Anything. That seems like she's trying to weaken your position. Judy let out a bitter laugh. Where do I start? She listed everything: the canceled contracts, the suppliers hesitating to work with her, the men on her property taking measurements for potential land development, the banking notice about the attempted change to her accounts. She's not just trying to take the farm, Judy said, voice tight with anger. She's trying to make it impossible for me to hold on to it. Mark nodded. Then we hit back just as hard. I'll file the injunction first thing tomorrow morning. In the meantime, document everything. Any letters, phone calls, emails, keep a record of every attempt she makes to interfere. Judy spent that night sifting through every piece of paper she had, searching for anything that could help her case. The financial records she had pulled earlier were stacked on her desk, the emails from her father to suppliers printed out and highlighted. She took photos of the legal notice on her gate, saved voicemails from hesitant business partners, even wrote down every odd interaction she had experienced over the past few weeks. She wouldn't let Samantha blindside her again. But the next morning, the attack escalated. She had barely stepped outside to feed the animals when she noticed the official-looking sign posted near the entrance to her driveway. Bold black letters announced that the property was under review for rezoning. Confused, she marched up to it, reading the fine print. It was a preliminary notice indicating that a request had been filed to change the land's designation. Her stomach twisted. Rezoning? That wasn't just an inconvenience, that was a direct assault on the farm's survival. If the land was reclassified, it could change everything from how she was allowed to use it to what types of businesses could operate on it. Worse, if it was shifted into a category that made it commercially viable for development, she could find herself locked into restrictions that would make running a farm nearly impossible. A deep sense of dread settled in her gut. Samantha wasn't just trying to take the farm, she was trying to dismantle it. Judy wasted no time calling Mark, barely able to keep her voice steady as she explained what she had found. This is bad, he admitted after a heavy silence. If the rezoning goes through, it could give her leverage to argue that the farm is no longer being used in its intended capacity. That would play right into her claim that the land should be divided or sold. How do we stop it? Judy demanded. Mark exhaled sharply. We fight it at the local zoning board. But this means she's already lobbying officials. She's not just working through the courts, she's using every possible avenue to make your life hell. Judy gritted her teeth. Then I need to do the same. She spent the next several days digging into the rezoning request, trying to find out who had submitted it and what their arguments were. The deeper she looked, the more she realized just how coordinated this attack had been. The application hadn't been filed under Samantha's name. It had come from a real estate consulting firm that specialized in acquiring agricultural land for urban expansion projects. It was worse than she thought. Samantha wasn't just looking for a payout. She was already making moves to sell. The betrayal burned hot in Judy's chest, but she forced herself to stay focused. She started making phone calls, reaching out to the local farming community, speaking to people who had dealt with zoning fights before. She found allies in unexpected places: older farmers who had seen this kind of underhanded tactic before, community members who didn't want to see their town overtaken by more development projects, even a local environmental group that had a vested interest in preserving farmland. But as she gathered her forces, Samantha struck again. Judy returned home late one evening to find a different kind of sign waiting for her, this one nailed to her barn door. Notice of violation. Her heart pounded as she scanned the paper. An anonymous complaint had been filed against the farm, claiming that it was not being maintained to proper agricultural standards. The accusations were vague, citing concerns about soil contamination and irregular livestock conditions. But the worst part was the final line. A formal inspection would be conducted within 7 days. Judy's blood ran cold. She was being set up. Samantha wasn't just trying to take control of the land, she was actively working to make it seem like Judy was unfit to manage it. If the inspection went poorly, it could be used as evidence in court, proof that Judy was struggling to maintain the property. Worse, it could lead to fines, penalties, even temporary shutdowns that would cripple her ability to operate the farm while the legal battle continued. For the first time, real panic set in. This wasn't just a legal dispute anymore. This was a coordinated campaign to destroy her. She took a slow, steadying breath and clenched her fists. Fine. If her sister wanted a war, then Judy would give her one. She wasn't just going to fight for the farm. She was going to make damn sure Samantha regretted ever trying to take it from her. Judy had always known her sister was ruthless, but she had never imagined just how far Samantha was willing to go. The rezoning notice had been the first real sign that this was bigger than a simple legal dispute, and the complaint leading to the inspection had only confirmed her worst fears. This was not a battle fought on a single front, it was an all-out assault on every part of her life. Samantha wasn't just trying to take the farm, she was working to make it unlivable, unmanageable, and unsustainable. She was planting doubt, manipulating systems, and twisting the law to work in her favor. And the worst part was that she was succeeding. The morning of the inspection came with a bitter wind, a storm brewing on the horizon in more ways than one. Judy had spent days preparing, double-checking every inch of the property, making sure that nothing could be twisted into evidence against her. She had gathered testimonies from workers, receipts for every maintenance expense, and even written records proving that her land was in full compliance with agricultural regulations. She wasn't naive, she knew that inspections like this weren't always about what was real, but about who could spin the most convincing narrative. When the inspectors arrived, they wasted no time getting to work. There were two of them, both dressed in official county-issued jackets, their expressions unreadable as they moved methodically through the property. One took soil samples near the livestock pens while the other checked structures for compliance with safety standards. They asked few questions, only taking notes, and Judy couldn't shake the feeling that their minds had already been made up before they even set foot on her land. She followed them as they worked, careful not to press too hard, answering when necessary but refusing to act defensive. She had nothing to hide. As they finished, one of them finally spoke. "We'll review our findings and get back to you within a few days." Judy didn't like that. She wanted answers now. "Is there anything specific that concerns you?" The inspector hesitated just a second too long before responding. There were a few flagged areas. "We'll have to see what the full report says." She clenched her teeth but nodded, watching as they left. As soon as their car disappeared down the long dirt road leading away from the farm, she exhaled sharply, trying to shake the tension from her shoulders. But there was no relief. She knew what was coming, and she was right. The report arrived 3 days later. Multiple citations. Some were minor things that could be fixed easily, like a missing safety marker on a grain silo, but others were far worse. The soil samples had allegedly shown inconsistent quality, suggesting improper fertilization, a violation that could lead to fines or even temporary shutdowns. There was also a flagged concern about livestock overcrowding despite Judy keeping strict records proving that she was well within the allowed limits. It was a coordinated attack, plain and simple. The accusations weren't about real violations. They were about creating paper trails evidence that could be used in court to paint her as an irresponsible owner. It was exactly the kind of ammunition Samantha needed. Judy sat at the kitchen table, the report spread out in front of her, her pulse pounding in her ears. She knew she had done everything right, but knowing and proving were two different things. That night, she didn't sleep. The next morning, she drove straight to Mark Davidson's office, storming inside without waiting for permission. He took one look at her face and sighed. "I take it the report wasn't in your favor." She dropped it onto his desk. "They're fabricating problems. The livestock numbers are within regulation, and I've never had soil issues before." Mark read through it carefully, his brow furrowing. "This is worse than I expected. These violations aren't just financial burdens, they could be used as grounds to argue that you're mismanaging the farm. If they press hard enough, they could use this to support a court-ordered transition of ownership while the case is ongoing." Judy's blood ran cold. "You're saying they could take me off my own land before the case is even finished?" Mark hesitated. "It's rare, but not impossible. If they can argue that the farm is suffering due to your negligence, a judge could appoint a temporary caretaker, someone neutral, to oversee operations until the case is settled." Judy's hands clenched into fists. And let me guess, Samantha already has someone lined up for the job. Mark exhaled slowly. It wouldn't surprise me. The realization hit her like a punch to the gut. This wasn't just about making her life miserable. It wasn't even about winning the farm in the long run. Samantha was trying to push her out right now. If she was removed from the property, it would give her sister complete access to run things however she wanted, to shape the narrative however it best suited her case. And once that happened, it would be infinitely harder for Judy to fight back. A cold, calculated fury settled in her chest. So how do we stop it? Mark steepled his fingers, thinking. First, we file an appeal on the violations, demanding an independent review. Second, we start gathering evidence that this inspection was biased. If we can show that someone on that team had prior connections to Samantha or the developers, we can undermine the credibility of the whole report. Third, he paused, glancing at her. We go public. Judy stiffened. I don't want this in the press. Mark leaned forward. This isn't about media attention. It's about making sure people see what's happening before it's too late. If we can get the farming community on your side, if we can get local business owners to back you, it will make it harder for Samantha to manipulate public opinion. Right now. She's working in the shadows, using bureaucracy against you. If we shine a light on it, she loses that advantage. Judy hated the idea of turning this into a spectacle, but she couldn't deny the logic. Samantha had been controlling the story, making moves while Judy played defense. If she wanted to win, she had to change the rules of engagement. Over the next few days, she did exactly that. She met with local farmers, explaining what was happening. She gathered signed statements from neighboring landowners who vouched for her farming practices. She reached out to agricultural committees, highlighting how her case could set a dangerous precedent for small farms everywhere. And then she found her first real crack in Samantha's plan. While digging through public records related to the rezoning request, she found a familiar name buried in the documents. The real estate consulting firm that had filed the request? They had worked with Samantha before. Specifically, they had handled property transfers for some of her past business dealings in commercial development. It was a direct connection, proof that Samantha wasn't just an interested party in the case, but that she had been working with developers behind the scenes long before she had even contested the will. Judy didn't wait. She took the evidence straight to Mark. He read through the papers, his eyes lighting up in a way she hadn't seen before. "This is it," he said. "This is the kind of conflict of interest that could throw her entire case into question. If we can prove that she had financial motives before your father even passed away, it weakens her claim that this is about family legacy." Judy let out a slow breath. For the first time in weeks, she felt something close to hope. Samantha had been winning by playing dirty, but she had finally made a mistake. And now, Judy had the ammunition to fight back. Judy had expected Samantha to fight back, but she hadn't expected her to escalate this quickly. The revelation about her sister's ties to the real estate consulting firm had been a turning point, something that shifted the balance of power in a way Judy hadn't felt since this all began. For the first time, Samantha had been caught making a mistake, leaving a direct link between herself and the developers who had been circling the farm like vultures. It was undeniable proof that this was never about family or fairness. It had been about money from the start. Mark had wasted no time filing an emergency motion to introduce the conflict of interest into the court proceedings, arguing that Samantha had been financially motivated long before their father's death, directly contradicting her claim that she was simply trying to restore fairness to the inheritance. It was a strong move, one that put her legal team on the defensive, and for a brief moment, Judy allowed herself to hope that maybe, just maybe, the tide was turning. She was wrong. Samantha struck back harder than ever. Within 24 hours, everything accelerated. The violations from the inspection, which should have gone through an appeals process, were suddenly pushed forward to enforcement. The county sent a letter demanding that Judy address the compliance issues immediately or face steep fines and potential shutdowns. It wasn't normal. It wasn't procedural. Someone was pulling strings behind the scenes to fast-track penalties before she even had a chance to fight them. Then came the next hit. She received an official letter from the zoning board, informing her that her appeal against the rezoning request had been denied without review due to insufficient evidence to contest the proposed reclassification. It was a lie. She had presented everything: signed statements, historical records, even proof that the consulting firm had direct ties to Samantha. None of it had mattered. The decision had been made before she even walked into the room. Judy stormed into Mark's office, slamming the papers onto his desk. "They're shutting me down before I can even fight back," she said, her voice sharp with frustration. Mark scanned the documents, his expression darkening with every sentence. "This isn't just legal maneuvering anymore," he said. "This is coordinated. She's got people working every angle, making sure every roadblock is put in place before you can react." Judy clenched her fists, breathing hard. "So what do? We go to the state level? Federal?" Mark nodded. "That's the only move we have left. If we can prove that there's corruption at play, that the zoning board and inspection team are working under undue influence, we might be able to get the decisions overturned. But it's going to take time, and in the meantime," he gestured to the papers, "you're still on the hook for compliance. If they shut down operations even temporarily, that's going to hurt you financially." Judy exhaled sharply, running a hand through her hair. She had already been stretched thin, trying to keep everything running while fighting this legal battle. A shutdown, even for a few weeks, could cripple her ability to sustain the farm. She had workers relying on her, suppliers expecting shipments, animals that needed care. Samantha knew that. That's why she was going after her through bureaucracy instead of the courts. And then, just when she thought she had absorbed the worst of it, Samantha delivered the final blow. A formal eviction notice was taped to her front gate. Judy ripped it down, scanning the words in disbelief. Samantha and their mother had filed for emergency possession of the property, citing gross mismanagement and legal disputes as grounds for temporary removal of the current occupant. The document claimed that due to the ongoing violations and zoning changes, a new caretaker should be placed in charge of the farm until the case was settled. Judy's hands shook as she read it. This was it. This was the endgame. Samantha wasn't waiting to win in court anymore. She was trying to physically remove Judy before the case was even decided. Heart pounding, Judy drove straight to Mark's office again, practically kicking his door open as she threw the notice onto his desk. "She's trying to evict me." Mark read the paper, his expression turning grim. "She's moving faster than I thought. If a judge signs off on this, you could be forced off the property within weeks, even days." Judy felt a cold sweat run down her back. "You said this wasn't common, that it was rare for a court to remove someone from their own property during a dispute." Mark looked at her, jaw tight. "It is. But if they can argue that the property is being harmed under your care, if they convince a judge that the farm's value is at risk, it could be enough to justify a temporary removal." Judy sat down hard, her mind racing. "So she doesn't even need to prove she's the rightful owner. She just needs to make it look like I'm ruining the farm." Mark nodded. "That's why she pushed so hard on the violations, the zoning board, the inspections. It was never about the long-term win. She just needs a reason to have you removed so she can take control now. And once you're out, it's a hell of a lot harder to fight back." Judy gritted her teeth, forcing herself to think. Samantha had always been calculating, but this was something else entirely. This was a coordinated effort to erase her presence from the land before she even had a chance to stop it. She inhaled deeply, steadying herself. "What do?" Mark hesitated for a fraction of a second. "We challenge it, obviously. We demand an immediate hearing and present evidence that this is a deliberate effort to oust you before the legal case is resolved." "But Judy," he exhaled. "This is going to be a brutal fight. She's already ahead of us. She's been working the system while we've been playing defense." Judy clenched her fists. "Then it's time we stop playing defense." That night, she made a decision. If Samantha wanted to push her off the farm, she was going to have to do it the hard way. Judy spent the next 24 hours reinforcing everything. She locked down financial accounts, ensuring that no unauthorized changes could be made. She secured backup funds in case Samantha tried to block her access to operating costs. She notified suppliers and workers, making sure they knew what was happening so they wouldn't be blindsided by false information. She even had security cameras installed at key locations on the property, knowing full well that if Samantha was desperate enough to try legal eviction, she might be desperate enough to try something more. She wouldn't go down without a fight. And when she finally faced Samantha in court to challenge the eviction order, she was ready for war. Judy had spent weeks preparing for this moment, yet as she walked into the courtroom, she could feel the weight of everything pressing down on her shoulders. The legal battle had stretched to its breaking point, and now it all came down to this. Samantha sat at the opposing table, composed and confident, her attorney beside her, flipping through documents with the ease of someone who had already won. Their mother was seated in the row behind them, her expression carefully neutral, though Judy knew exactly where her loyalties lay. This wasn't just a fight over the farm anymore. This was a fight for survival, and Judy was well aware that if she lost today, she wouldn't just be walking away from land. She would be walking away from the only life she had ever known. The judge called the session to order, and Samantha's lawyer was the first to speak. He laid out their case with precision, arguing that Judy had allowed the farm to fall into disrepair, citing the zoning violations, the compliance issues, the alleged mismanagement that had led to a government review. He painted her as a struggling farmer clinging to a failing operation, unwilling to accept that change was necessary, unwilling to acknowledge that perhaps it was time for someone more competent to take over. Samantha sat still, hands folded neatly in front of her, her expression unreadable as the lawyer continued, stating that the farm had already been appraised for potential alternative development, that investors were ready to revitalize the property, and that it would be a shame to let stubborn sentimentality stand in the way of progress. Judy felt the rage rise inside her, but she kept her expression neutral. Losing control now wouldn't help her. Then it was Mark's turn. He stood, calm but firm, and systematically dismantled every point Samantha's lawyer had made. He presented the financial records proving that the farm was profitable, that the compliance issues had been fabricated, that the rezoning had been pushed through by interested third parties connected to Samantha's real estate deals. He pointed out the clear conflict of interest, showing evidence that Samantha had been working with developers before their father had even passed away. He introduced sworn affidavits from agriculture officials, local business owners, and financial experts, all confirming that the farm was not failing, that the accusations of mismanagement were strategic, not factual. Then came the real blow. Mark placed a thick folder on the judge's bench. "Your Honor," he said, his voice steady, "we have obtained copies of confidential communication between the real estate consulting firm and the buyers interested in this land. In these documents, it is explicitly stated that the deal was already in motion before my client's father had even fallen ill. The only delay, according to these records, was the fact that the farm had not yet changed ownership. The buyer was assured that, quote, the legal transfer was being handled, Your Honor. This is not the behavior of a party acting in good faith. This is the behavior of someone who knew exactly what they were doing, who knew they were going to take this land by any means necessary, regardless of the legalities." The room fell silent. Samantha's lawyer flipped through the documents hastily, his composed demeanor cracking for the first time. Samantha herself paled, her posture going rigid as she realized that Judy had beaten her at her own game. Their mother turned toward her, murmuring something under her breath, but Samantha didn't respond. The judge sighed, removing his glasses and rubbing his temples. "Miss Maxwell," he said, addressing Samantha directly, his tone carrying none of the patience he had displayed earlier. "These documents indicate a level of premeditation that cannot be ignored. Your argument rests on the idea that you acted out of concern for the welfare of the property. Yet these records show clear intent to remove your sister before ownership had even been legally contested. This is not about the best interests of the farm. This is about profit." Samantha's lips parted slightly, as if she wanted to respond, but she said nothing. Judy didn't allow herself to feel victory yet. Not until it was over. The judge turned his attention back to Mark. "The evidence provided is substantial. The request for emergency possession of the property is denied. Furthermore, In light of the conflicts of interest and the financial motives presented, I am ruling in favor of the original will. The farm remains the sole property of Judith Maxwell, as per her father's documented wishes. For a moment, the words didn't quite register. It was as if the room had frozen, the air thick with the realization of what had just happened. Judy had won. She let out a slow breath, her grip on the table loosening as the tension that had lived in her chest for weeks finally began to dissipate. Across the courtroom, Samantha looked stunned, her carefully constructed world crashing down around her. Their mother sat beside her, staring straight ahead, her hands clenched tightly together, unwilling to meet Judy's eyes. It was over. The judge gavelled the court into adjournment, and just like that, the battle that had consumed her life for months was finished. She stood slowly, watching as Samantha and her lawyer gathered their things in silence. As she turned to leave, Judy spoke for the first time. "You never wanted this farm," she said, voice quiet but steady. Samantha hesitated, but she didn't argue. She simply looked away and kept walking. Judy watched her go, feeling no satisfaction in her sister's defeat, only relief that it was finally over. She had spent her life fighting for this land, protecting it, nurturing it, keeping it alive against all odds. And now, no one could take it from her. No one ever would. The silence that followed the judge's ruling felt heavier than the battle itself. It was not the victorious kind of silence, not the kind that came with celebration or relief, but the quiet that settled after something irrevocable had changed. The courtroom emptied slowly, murmurs fading into the hallways, but Judy remained seated for a moment, letting the weight of what had just happened sink into her bones. It was over. The farm was hers. The fight was finished. Yet instead of triumph, all she felt was exhaustion, a deep, lingering weariness that refused to lift even as the threat disappeared. Samantha had left without another word, avoiding eye contact, her perfect composure cracking only in the way she clenched her fists at her sides. Their mother had followed a step behind, never once turning back, and Judy hadn't called after her. There was nothing left to say. The finality of it was like a closing door, not slammed shut in anger, but latched firmly, without room for argument. It didn't feel like a victory. It felt like an ending. Mark gathered his files, giving her a small nod. "You did it," he said, his voice calm, lacking the usual energy he carried after a win. He knew, he understood that this wasn't a moment for celebration. "Let's get the paperwork finalized. I'll file the dismissal for the rezoning claims, and we'll get an injunction in place to prevent any further challenges to the will. After this, they won't be able to come after you again." Judy nodded, standing slowly. "Thank you," she said, and she meant it. Mark had been relentless, had fought for her when she didn't know how to fight for herself, and if not for him, she might have lost everything. By the time she made it back to the farm, the sun was setting, casting long golden shadows over the fields. The wind carried the familiar scent of tilled earth, of grain and hay, the comforting smells of the only home she had ever known. She stood at the edge of the driveway, looking out at the land, the silhouettes of the barns and silos stretching against the fading light. It was strange how little had changed, despite how much had nearly been lost. The farm had endured, just as it always had, just as she always had. But the weight in her chest didn't ease. She had won, but at what cost? The family she had fought against was still her family, and now there was a fracture between them that would never fully heal. Her father had been the anchor, the force that had kept them tethered together despite their differences, and now, without him, they had all drifted into separate directions, pulled apart by greed, by resentment, by things that had festered long before this battle had begun. Maybe she had always known it would come to this. Maybe she had just refused to see it. That night, she sat on the porch with a cup of coffee, staring at the distant lights of the neighboring farms. It was quiet, the kind of stillness that usually brought her peace, but tonight it only left room for thoughts she didn't want to entertain. She wondered if her father would be proud of how she had handled things, if he would have wanted her to fight this hard, if he would have been disappointed that it had come to this at all. She had never doubted that she was meant to keep the farm, but the way it had happened, the things that had been said, The bridges that had burned, none of it felt like something he would have wanted. A car pulled up to the gate, and she tensed before recognizing the vehicle. It wasn't Samantha. It wasn't their mother. It was Richard Vaughn, one of the older farmers from the next property over. He had been a friend of her father's, one of the few people who had stood by her when the fight had begun. She hadn't spoken to him since before the final hearing, and seeing him now, unannounced, made her stomach tighten with something close to dread. She met him halfway down the driveway, arms crossed over her chest. "You here to tell me I should have handled things differently?" Richard shook his head. "No," he said simply. "I'm here to tell you that you did what you had to do." Judy exhaled, some of the tension in her shoulders easing. "Doesn't feel like much of a win." Richard studied her for a long moment, then gestured toward the farm. "You kept it," he said. "That's the win. You did what your father would have done." She looked away, staring out at the land stretching beyond them. "And what about them?" she asked, though she already knew the answer. Richard sighed. "Some people don't come back from things like this," he admitted. "Some fights leave scars too deep to heal. But you can't control that. You didn't make this war, Judy. You just refused to lose it." She nodded, accepting the truth in his words, even if it didn't make her feel any better. In the weeks that followed, she focused on the farm. The court filings were finalized, the rezoning claims dismissed. The fines from the bogus violations dropped after an independent review proved that the initial inspections had been tainted by conflicts of interest. Samantha had been forced to withdraw all claims, and with the legal battle over, she had disappeared back into her life in the city. Their mother, ever the pragmatist, had called once, a short conversation that consisted mostly of awkward pleasantries before ending with a hollow, "Take care of yourself, Judy," didn't expect to hear from her again. The days slowly returned to normal, though normal felt different now. There were no more legal notices tacked to the fence, no more whispered questions from suppliers, no more waiting for the next attack. The fight was over, but in its place was something emptier, a lingering quiet where conflict had once filled the space. And then, one evening, a letter arrived. It was from Samantha. Not a legal document, not another challenge, just a single page, handwritten in neat, deliberate strokes. Judy hesitated before unfolding it, unsure if she even wanted to know what it said. It wasn't an apology. She hadn't expected one. But it wasn't another fight either. "You got what you wanted," it read. "I hope you know it wasn't just about the money. Maybe one day you'll understand why I did what I did. Maybe not. Either way, it's done. You won. Don't waste it." There was no signature, no indication that she would ever reach out again. Judy stared at the words, reading them over and over, trying to decipher what Samantha had meant, if there had been some deeper reason behind everything beyond greed, beyond resentment. Maybe there was. Maybe there wasn't. It didn't matter. She folded the letter, tucked it away in a drawer, and never looked at it again. The farm had survived, and so had she. The fight had cost her more than she had expected, but she hadn't lost what mattered most, and as she stood on her porch that night, staring out at the fields under the fading light, she realized that despite everything, she had no regrets. This land was hers. It always had been. And now, no one could take it away.